What's up, friends? Welcome back to the show. Today, I spoke to Daniel Grose. He has an Instagram channel called Honest Fatherhood, and that's what this conversation is all about today. Fatherhood. More importantly, honest fatherhood, which means the highs, the lows, and everything in between. And Daniel's got quite an incredible story, a hard story in some respects, a lot of childhood trauma and abuse, and a lack, really, of father role models, and how he's kind of overcame that, alchemized that to understand what is required of him to really be this whole man, this integrated father, and just sharing his wisdom and his insights on this journey of being a dad to 4 boys and a husband and a Christian and a teacher and an educator. And I think there's just so much value in this conversation for dads, aspiring dads, moms, families, and everything in between. So without further ado, Mr. Daniel Grose. Daniel Grose, welcome to the show, my friend. I have been looking forward to this one for quite some time. We connected on Instagram quite a while back, and I've been following what you get up to, and I love it. And it's going to be a conversation today all about fatherhood, more particularly honest fatherhood, which I think is an important distinction. But before we even get to the fatherhood piece, you've also got a pretty remarkable healing story of your own journey with animal-based dieting, ancestral living, because you were having some pretty serious gut issues, right? So before we get to the crux of today's topic, take me on a little bit of that healing journey too, because I thought that was a really fascinating overlap here.
Yeah, I will tell you, and like you said, it is an overlap. Fatherhood is tied to health. I can't be the father I want to be if my health is suffering. And I mean, that was really what prompted the animal-based thing. But so let's go back. I'm 40 years old now. I'm married. I have 4 kids. The youngest is 1, the oldest is 12, and they're all boys. It is a high energy household, and we run it that way. We want our boys to be free, full of energy, and a little bit wild because that's their nature. All right. So if you go back when I was around 28, I was self-employed. I had a landscape design firm and an installation team, but I wore all the hats. And all of a sudden, man, I started having gut inflammation and having to go to the bathroom. I mean, constantly and with urgency. And I kind of dealt with it as I could. And the doctors were like, you need to go see a GI guy. Well, when I turned 30, somewhere in that year, it got so intense and the pain was just excruciating. I spent 2 days just, I mean, not to get too graphic, but just on the bathroom floor. I mean, the way I described it, it felt like I had eaten glass and jalapeno peppers.
Oof.
And I was in misery. I was having these, what felt like contractions, similar to what my wife went through with
Mm-hmm.
labor pains, where I was just doubled over on the ground in excruciating pain. So I was hospitalized for a week. And that's where I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. They put me on lots of steroids and things to get the inflammation down. But, when I had the colonoscopy, the doctor basically said, you can do rounds of steroids. There are a few pretty potent drugs that you can be on forever, but likely you're going to have your colon taken out around age 50, or you're going to die of colon cancer.
Sheesh.
Which was, not great since I worked in such a physical way. So my wife and I were already, we had already drunk the Kool-Aid of alternative medicine. We're pretty granola. My wife is very granola. Um, we had all our kids at home. She's already kind of got this spin of not necessarily trusting everything you hear from the medical world.
Mm-hmm.
So we started looking into diets, and I tried a lot of different diets with varying success. Some of them worked great simply because I was taking out processed foods, Coca-Cola's, fast food, and alcohol. So, but I never really found healing. And we did like the GAPS diet, which is gut and psychology
Yep.
syndrome. It's an extreme elimination diet where I went down to just broth, homemade broth, and fermented foods. And that was okay. I did Whole30. I was vegan for 6 months. I did grain-free, paleo, keto. I did every single diet, and I never got completely better. So I would go through a diet, it would be okay, and then I would go back to having gut issues. I would end up having to go to the doctor and do a round of prednisone. But a couple years ago, I got to this point where I was so tired. I would go to work from 8 to 5. I would come home at 5 and have to go to bed. And we had 3 sons,
Mm-hmm.
right? And my wife was doing all the heavy lifting. So when you think of being a father, I'm like, I have got to get this figured out. We were talking about having our 4th child. And I was like, I've got to get something going on. And so I was going to the doctor again, and he was going to have me go to sleep studies, have blood work done, um, different just rounds of treatment because they didn't know what to do. And I listened to a random podcast where Jordan Peterson talked about going on the carnivore diet.
Right.
And I hadn't eaten breakfast that day. So I was like, I'm going to try this just randomly. So I just had chicken for dinner. And by the end of a week, I was in almost complete remission. Um,
Wow.
and look, I'm just going to tell you, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm not selling an animal based diet. I don't have expertise in this area. Like, I'm just sharing what worked for me. Within a week of carnivore diet, I was really strict that first week. I had chicken and beef, and that was it. It was very boring. Man, I stuck on it for 30 days, and it was just meat for 30 days, and I felt better than I had felt in a decade
Mm-hmm.
in just 30 days. Um, Man, that was cool. I don't know how to say this other than I felt like I got my life back.
Mm-hmm.
Like it opened up possibility again. So I might share this later, but my father, my biological father, died of colon cancer 4 years ago. So that was a very real thing. And I had almost quit thinking about that season of life after kids of being a grandfather and being with my wife. I'm like, I'm probably going to die at age 50 or 60 from cancer. And man, it was just heavy. But after that 30 days, it renewed energy, renewed hope. I felt like myself again. So I stuck with it. I kind of transitioned into like a carnivore version of the keto diet, and stuck with that for a while and just kept getting better. And eventually, I came around to just animal based diet altogether. So every now and then, I'll do like 30 days of carnivore and then kind of get back into animal based diet, which gives me much more liberty to just eat more foods and have
Yep.
some carbohydrates every now and then. But for 6 months, it was very little carbs, just meat. But man, I can't tell you how much life I have gotten back from that. Just being able to wrestle with my kids, do cross country practice with them, um, to be able to have the energy and the emotional wherewithal to have a conversation about life with my wife at 9:30 at night instead of being like, "Babe, I'm dead. I got to go to sleep right
Mm-hmm.
now. Like I have nothing left to give you." So the health thing has been really important for me.
Yeah, man, it's such a powerful story. It's one we hear a lot. You know, we're obviously big proponents. We do have a dog in this fight. We want to get people on the proper human diet, which
I know
we
you do.
think looks like animal-based dieting. You know, and so often we see this trajectory. I tried everything. You literally tried everything. Some of it worked to varying degrees for a little bit, and then it didn't work. And then you go on this meat pill, if you will. It's carnivore, and then it's healing, and then it's like adding the nature's most abundant foods back, so you can have a little bit of bandwidth with your diet, and then you end up with something like your meats and your fruits, and that's probably something like the best human diet for most people most of the time. But the point being, it gave you your energy back. And I think you said something there that's really important. It wasn't just, when we think about energy and health, we often think physical, which is obviously really important, especially if you're in a household with 4 boys and they're going to be crazy.
Right.
And I get that. I've got 2. So hats off to you, my friend, with 4. I can't even imagine. But you said the kind of like energy to be emotionally available too, to think, to be able to have conversations with your wife, to be able to actually have a little bit left over in the tank when all the monsters have passed out to the end of the day, so you can actually still be present with your wife. Like, energy is the currency of life, my man. So I'm so happy you found that, and I know that it's forefront of everything that you talk about now. Even though you're not a health guy, you do understand the value of having your health, so you can be a present father and you can put that back into your families.
Yeah, and I would definitely say that that diet component has been the strongest component of health for me. I do a lot of other stuff. I do exercise, I do intermittent fasting, I do ice baths, I do grounding and breath work. I do a lot of stuff. But if I was at a 0, the diet thing brought me back up to like a 7, 7.5. And it's all those other things that kind of get me up to the 8.5 or, level 9. I think level 10 comes with time. Like that's the
Yeah.
ingredient. It's just doing these things over time. But that's my story, man. The diet changed everything for me.
It's very cool. It's very cool. And I hope the dads that are maybe coming over from your audience just really take a good look at that. You know, how am I fueling myself for the greatest adventure of life, which is to be a dad? And if I can have more energy, naturally I can put that back into hopefully being a better father. So let's shift gears and get into fatherhood. Why did you start sharing your journey? And did you ever picture that you'd be here like sitting on 150,000 followers, some of your videos getting over 1 million plays, starting all kinds of conversations on the topic? What was the motivation for starting sharing your journey?
Yeah. First of all, I had no idea it was going to do that. I thought if I get 10,000 followers after a couple years, that would be really awesome. So that it's really crazy. Um, there's a couple reasons why I started it. There's two really. The first one is uh, I went through a lot of stuff. I'm sure we'll get into it today. And every time I would tell my story, people were like, "You need to write a book. Like you need to share this stuff with the world." So I started writing a book, and the Instagram page was just to kind of put those thoughts out in the world and test it out and just see what came back and to help me clarify, like, what are my thoughts? How do I want to say it? How do I communicate it to people? So I started sharing on Instagram for that reason. But the real heart of it is, when I was 26, 27, you have the arrogance and naivety of youth. And I don't think those are bad things. Every 25 and 26-year-old should feel like they can face the world. Man, I thought I was going to be this perfect father, perfect husband, and like this decamillionaire by the time I was like 40 and living the life, and that I could do all of it. And, I wasn't tested in life. I hadn't faced those things. And when life started to hit, like real life, like being married to someone, managing, being self employed and an entrepreneur, and having kids, and I started messing up and I would say failing and doing things that I swore I would never do, being a man and in situations I thought I would never be in with my
Mm-hmm.
home. And I didn't have fathers to look back to ask, like, how did you navigate this? And I felt alone and I felt like I was groping through the dark. And it was hard. And there was a lot of pain that we went through to grow through those situations. And so many young men from early 20s to like mid 30s are in that same situation. They feel like they're groping through the dark. They don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. They're overworked, overtired, alone, and just carrying burdens that they just are going through the motions, not knowing if they'll ever get out of it. I think there is a better life to be lived than that can be full of joy. And so I'm like, I want to share my journey because it might resonate with someone. They might take the steps I made, miss some of the mistakes I had, and it can help lives. I think men are important. So it was that heart that made me want to start sharing these things.
That's beautiful, man. And I think what really resonates for most people about your message is the honesty in it. Like you said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows and farting pixie dust and the Instagram world of look at how perfect this is and look at how perfect I am. It's honest fatherhood for a reason. So tell me a little bit more about, like picking that name for a reason and making honesty and the truth of this journey part of your message.
I had a negative relationship with social media before I started this page. So if I was going to do it, I didn't want it to be, putting forth this ideal life because that perpetuates the problem and it perpetuates loneliness. I feel like everyone thinks they've got it all together. And the thing about fatherhood is I feel like it's the ultimate test, marriage and fatherhood, the ultimate test for all men. I have known executives, preachers, plumbers, and no matter who you are on your journey, every man comes to the end of himself in fatherhood, and almost every man feels alone in it and feels like they've got it all together. And social media and Instagram, it just makes that problem so much worse. You
Mm-hmm.
look at what everybody else is doing, you compare yourself, and then you feel worse about it. You feel ashamed of the problems and the struggle that you have, because you're weak. You don't have it together. If you were a better man, you'd have what those dudes have.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that's not true at all. Even the guys who look like they have it together really struggle. And I love when I hear another man tell me, like, yeah, I'm falling apart. Like, this is going on in my marriage. My kids are disrespecting me. Like, I feel burned out and I can't handle it at work. I'm like, I feel so encouraged by that. I don't feel weighed down by it. I feel encouraged. So if I was going to get online and put out my story, I wanted it to be relatable and real so that actual healing might happen in other people's lives. Because I don't want to hear from someone who's got it all together. Like,
Right.
you don't know my life. Um, but another man who's been broken and is still going and is still hopeful. I'm like, that's the man I want to hear from. So that was the story behind Honest Fatherhood as a name.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that, man. I feel very similar. I don't want to learn to skateboard from the guy that's never stepped foot on the board and taken some tumbles along the way. I want to learn from the people that have been in it, and they've had the backs on the ropes and they've taken a few punches and learned to come back. Those stories are really inspiring. And you've taken a few punches, man. We've talked offline about your story and your upbringing, and you teased it a little bit that you didn't really have the father figures to mold yourself from. So take us back a little bit on the journey of how you overcame, because I think when people hear this, they'll have a lot of respect for where you're at and how you've became the victor over your circumstances instead of being a victim to them. So take us a little bit on the journey of what childhood was like for you and what the father role was like for you growing up.
Okay, I'll try to make it as short as I can. Of course, there's a lot to it, but my mom was married to my father, so I will refer to my biological father as Cecil, and my stepdad is Dad, just for clarification. So my mom divorced Cecil when I was 4. He was an addict. He had had multiple affairs, and at one point, my mom said, I don't want this to be the man that raises my son. And then she remarried when I was 5. And at that time, my stepdad was our knight in shining armor. He was a fireman. He was like just a man's man. I often look back at him and think he was everything a man should be. So for a while, we kind of had this good situation where I went back and forth. On the weekends, I saw Cecil. He lived with my grandmother. So I saw him on the weekends, and then I was at home. Um, when you're a child, you always see the best version of the people in your life. That's one of the beauty of children. Your father can be a terrible person. He's still going to be your
Mm-hmm.
hero, right? So the first big, I think, traumatic event that defined a lot of my life back then was when I was 10. So I didn't know Cecil was an addict, but we got news he had shot and killed the girl that he was dating at the time. Okay. Um, I knew her, I knew her kids, and that was this surreal moment that I could not wrap my head around. And my hero, Cecil, Superman, like he was buff, he was cool, he was charismatic. Which a lot of time you will find that addicts are very fun people to be around. Like they're the life of the party. Sometimes it's because they're high, um, but they can be lovable people. And Cecil had that charisma, so I loved him. So that was such a traumatic thing because I couldn't wrap my head around it. And from that point, I carried on this thing of like I'm different. Like I've got this weight that I can't tell people about, that I have to grieve alone and keep to myself. So you don't want to unload all that onto other people. And around that same time, my stepdad started using drugs. He had used them in the past, and he had a work accident and was prescribed some pain pills. And that started a downward spiral for him. Now he's also bipolar, so he already has highs and lows and already had Prozac and Wellbutrin and different medications he tried throughout the years to level him off. He was a very hot tempered guy. He has like Italian heritage, so he can get angry and he's ready to back it up. So it's not, you know, just fluff. So when he started doing drugs and that interacted with his being bipolar, um, it created I don't know how to say it. It created a nightmare. And I love him. I don't want to put him under the bus, but my childhood was a place of fear and chaos. We stayed away from him as much as he could because you never knew what he was going to do. Like spankings and discipline. I don't say that I was abused. That word is thrown around a lot,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes in very real ways. Sometimes I think it's overused. Um, but when he disciplined us, it was out of anger and there was no structure to it. It was, throwing us down, smacking us, cussing us out, that kind of a thing. And, I might not share the darkest parts of it, but it was a regular basis that he
Mm-hmm.
would smash everything in the house, that we would leave. My mom and me and my 2 brothers would leave, and then we'd come back and he'd promise he'd change, and then he'd go back and relapse. And it was like this over and over again. I will say this on behalf of my mom. She took the brunt of a lot of that for us. Um, Even though we lived in fear a lot of the time, she kind of stood as I would say protector, but absorber of
Mm-hmm.
his anger. Um, she had to stay because if she had left, we would have lost my connection to my stepbrother, who I love dearly to this day. Um, we would have lost him, and my mom was his main stable parent at the time, even as his stepmom. Um, so we did that. About the time I was 16 or 17, he quit being so angry and aggressive and just went comatose, kind of like a zombie on the couch all the time, and was just never present, never there. Um, so that was a lot of the stuff I went through as a boy and as a young man growing up. And then finally, around the time I was 20 or 21, I was big enough to stand up for myself, and I was like, I'll never hear him talk to my mom that
Mm-hmm.
way again without fighting. And he was the kind of man, if I had fought him, he was going to fight to the death. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he's not going to let his son stand up to him in his house. That wasn't the house we had. So I had to leave. So I moved out of the house and left, and carried a lot of baggage with me into the rest of my life from those years. Um, so that's the backstory. So if you want me to get into how I overcame that, um, there's really two things that I could share with you. So I'll share the first one. And the first thing is finding something that, as a human being, I don't care where you get it from. I'll share where I got it from, but it gives you value, meaning, and purpose as a human to stand on. And I'll connect all this stuff in a minute. But so for me, that was like my faith. I'm a Christian, and I was really hesitant, knowing that might come up in this podcast. Um, I'm always hesitant to say that to people because a lot of people have been wounded by organized religion, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not what I'm talking about when I say that. But if you have a wound in a relationship with words like I might talk about the word aggression later in our negative relationship with that. People have a negative relationship with the word Christian because Christians have often used organized religion to box up God and control people. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about a relationship to God. And I had wounds from my father. He was the man that was supposed to give from both of them. They were supposed to give me love, approval, validation, teach me that I was worth it, and then show me how to be a man of my own salt. And since I didn't get that from them, I was likely going to be a slave to searching for that throughout my life and trying to find that in every relationship, every career choice, everything that I did could have been defined by that need that I didn't get from my dad. I found that in my relationship to God, this idea of like, you are created, you're worth love, like you were thoughtfully created and pursued. And knowing that I had worth and value based on that was extremely healing for me. So if the Christian thing turned somebody off, I'm like, but the end result was this idea that I am worthy, I am valued. So wherever you find that in your life, having a belief system that sustains your worth, um, throughout the ups and downs of life is really important. Like, so that's a spiritual and philosophical aspect to the healing. Um, okay, so there's that. I have analyzed this a lot because I've been asked to analyze it a lot, and I don't want to be cheesy, but I kind of came up with these four things that really helped me heal, and they matter a lot. The first thing was acceptance, right? Accepting what happened to you, because for the longest time I was like, I don't I don't care about you. I didn't need you. I didn't need your love. I'm strong enough to do without it. So I wouldn't accept it. I just buried it. And when I did that, it would come back up in my marriage. It would come back up when I was pressed, when I was stressed out or overworked. Those things came back out. So you can't just avoid the wounds of your father. Like, you do have to accept, I did need you when I was a child. You did have power over me, and you didn't do what you were supposed to do. And I was left with the wound. And just say it and be real about it. Don't say I didn't need you and I've moved on, because then
Mm-hmm.
you can't heal. I've said this before. A wound unacknowledged is a wound unhealed. Um, so there's acceptance, and then there's grief. Like, you need to grieve over it. So I grieved what happened to us, what happened to my mom, the relationship with my dad that I should have had, especially now that I have a good relationship with my kids. I had to grieve that I actually never had that. Um, I grieve the trauma my kids have had from the baggage that I've carried into fatherhood. Like, you had to have a moment to grieve the loss of what could have been and of what happened. And it's really important, though, that you don't get stuck there, because that's where you get to be a victim.
Mm-hmm.
You get stuck in grief, you never move on. So it's a good tool, but you need to move on from it once you've had your grief. And you may have more than one moment in your life, but don't get stuck there. So after you kind of grieve, then you're like, so what now? I've accepted it, I've grieved it. For me, it was analyzing, like, how has this affected my life, and how do I need to work on it? How do I heal it? Um, for me, there was this thing of, there were certain attributes of myself, personality traits, that were defense mechanisms when I was in that survival mode, that have sabotaged my life as an adult. Um, like being a workaholic and trying to gain love through accomplishment, because my dad gave me accomplishment when I achieved things. Um, he gave me love and affirmations, or when I achieved things. And that has sabotaged some things later in my
Mm-hmm.
life. So, like, working on myself, like, how has that hurt me? How's it manifesting in my life now? How do I address all of those things and start to do the emotional work, the spiritual work, create disciplines around healing those things? So, getting off your butt in grief, you're putting yourself to work to heal. And once you come to a place, this is the step four, is forgiveness, where you have healed as a person. I do think it's really important, like for me, to step back and look at my dad and say, you know what, though, he was also a man who was like me, who came to fatherhood, who also had a father who was just as hard on him, if not worse, who came from a line of men who were that way. He didn't know what he was doing, and he was groping through the dark. And yeah, he made decisions that he shouldn't have made, but it enabled me, when I failed and became less a man than I wanted to be, to have some empathy and compassion for him. And I was eventually able to stand on firm enough ground to forgive the man who had caused me pain in the first place. So getting to forgiveness of the people who victimized you in the first place, I feel like, is the final step. There's no final, it's a process. You always go through it. So forgiving them, and forgiving them doesn't necessarily mean, it's all rainbows and hugs. The relationship may still not be able to come back. They still may be a really toxic, abusive person, and not willing to change. So it may not redeem the relationship. Forgiveness is not for them. Forgiveness is for you, so
Mm-hmm.
that you can move on. But sometimes it does bring reconciliation to the relationship that wasn't there before. And sometimes that you won't believe what it redeems. So that was kind of my process, from going from victim to overcoming it. And I wouldn't call myself a victor. I experienced victories continuously throughout
Yeah.
the process of living a life.
It's
So
so powerful,
that's it.
man. And I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think everybody's got a story, and men oftentimes do suffer in silence. And whilst that is hopefully a rare and extreme story, I don't think it's as rare as we think it is. To have these kind of abusive, absent emotionally or physically fathers in the home. And I think something you said there is to understand, like, the generational echoes of trauma that are being passed down, that in a sense, your dad did as good as he could have done with the tools and the mentors that came before him. And it's taken almost this really tough situation that you've been in to break you down completely enough where you say, okay, enough. And I love that you've put kind of a 4-step system to it. And you also acknowledge that, hey, it's a process. I haven't, finished this thing. I'm not some kind of complete guru now that knows all the answers, but I'm working through it. And I just love that it finished with forgiveness. And what you said is something that I came to realize recently, was forgiveness is really an act of self-love, because when you can't forgive someone, you are in resistance, which goes back to your point one, which is you have to accept it. If you can't accept it, you're constantly in resistance. You're holding this person prisoner in your mind, but the only thing that you're actually doing by holding them in that prison is hurting yourself. And you have to work through some kind of healing and system to get to the point where you can actually forgive, reconcile, and accept it, so you can move forward now. There's cheesy lines galore, but there's a reason that the forward-facing mirror is bigger than the rear-view mirror, and it's because we have to put our sights forward. But we have to also understand where we came from. And I think it sounds like you've alchemized that really well, of kind of knowing that, hey, I went through some tough stuff and now I'm using it. And I think there's also an important insight there that if you don't have the role models, like you didn't have this perfect path that was lined up for your father that came before you, you almost have like a reverse role model of saying, well, this is what I'm not going to do. I know how hard that was for me. I know how difficult that is. So at least I can go against that and say, I'm not going to be that to my children. I'm not going to lay hands on them unnecessarily. I'm not going to be checked out. I'm not going to go down the path of checking out, using drugs and not being there, because I know what that did to me and I couldn't possibly think of doing that to my children. So just a really cool story, man, and really empowering for people to hear that even the darkest moments can be overcame with enough love and compassion and awareness and a willingness to work through those things. So you said a few things, getting into this conversation, that you believe in men. You believe that men are important. You believe that fatherhood's important. And of course I do too. And it's interesting that sometimes that is even a remotely controversial statement in today's world, but it can get there in some of these spaces, right? So how do you see the role of the father in a family?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to this statement I said before of, we have a relationship to a word or a philosophy when we experienced those things in an unhealthy, imbalanced, or toxic form. So I'm going to say some words that I know from having an Instagram page. If I say these words in the real, people are going to go, that's old gender roles, that's patriarchy, that's all of that oppressive stuff. Because admittedly, I think men have used these words to have an authoritarian role and sometimes really oppressive roles in the past. So the three words that kind of come to my mind are leader, protector, and provider. Um, so when I say leader, I don't mean, again, authoritarian, they make the decisions or whatever. And I have never once made a decision where my wife wasn't intimately involved in like real life decisions, um, because I love her. I respect her. She has wisdom that I don't have. We make all our decisions together. There is none of this, like, I'm the leader, or, with the Christian thing, I'm head of the household. I don't believe in any of that, nor do I think that would strengthen my marriage. Rachel and I are together in all the decisions we make, and that goes both ways. She does the same with me when she is trying to seek some kind of counsel for something. We are our first go to for that. When I say leader, Simon Sinek wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. And around that time, he had this meme that he kept putting out that I really loved. So if you can imagine the picture, the above picture was a guy sitting on a rock and a bunch of guys trying to hoist this big boulder with the guy sitting on it.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a whip. That's a very provocative image. It makes you think of slavery. Um, and then down below it was the next image. And it was that guy that was on the rock. He's now at the front of the line, pulling in front and trying to cheer on his fellow people to go. Right. So whenever I say, I love that imagery right there. I think it's powerful. So when I say leadership, I mean servant leadership. Like, I mean, you're the head servant of that family. Seth Godin has a quote that I really love. He says, the job of a leader is to create the conditions in which other people can thrive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that constantly. I've got 24 employees at work, and I've got a wife and 3 kids. So I'm always thinking about, how do I do that? How do I create an atmosphere in the home where my wife can be the most beautiful, free, loving, and creative version of herself? And the same for my kids, that they can live into who they truly are. So I think that perspective on leadership, it kind of disarms the authoritarian, my way is the highway, do as I
Yes.
say, not as I do with your kids. Um, Old patriarchy idea of leader. That's not being a leader at all. That's called being a dictator. That is oppressive. So identifying leadership and the narrative around leadership around being a servant and loving. And then with my kids, it really comes into being a guide too, because they're 4 boys and they look to me to be their leader and guide. So leader, protector is a big one. There's a guy I follow on Instagram. I won't say his name, but I'm going to throw him under the bus. But the other day he was talking about, protecting his family, and he said all these old things, and I don't disagree with any of them. He's like, when we walk down the street, I stand on the roadside, and my wife stands on the curbside. So if a car comes,
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna run over me and not her. If we go into a restaurant, I sit facing the door, so if someone comes in and starts shooting up the place, like I can get my wife. And he gave these classic examples, and it's like, I agree with all that stuff, but the fact of the matter is, it's very rare, if ever, that any man is going to be in that situation. And likely, if it is, there's not a whole lot you can really do. A car's going to hit both of you. You might both get shot in the restaurant. So I like the heart. I was like, that's not what being a protector really is. So protector to me really has to include protecting your family from things that would seek to come get them. So that can be a lot. It can be bad diets. It can be sugar and Coke and all, because that's going to come at you from everywhere. Everywhere your kids go to a camp, like even when we go to church, they often serve my kids treats and cookies and donuts. But why are y'all giving poison to my kids here at church? Like they'll do that, right? In social media, I don't want my son who's 12 to go somewhere and start scrolling and see all the eye candy. And his relationship with women is now one, it begins like his sexual relationship to women is objectification and not love and connection, because the first thing that aroused him before he even knew what was going on with his anatomy was, girls twerking or doing squats, and there's the close up, right on the yoga pants. I want to protect my kids from those things. I want to protect my wife from burnout, from having to carry the emotional load that I should be responsible for too. So I really think emotional protection from things that would seek to break my children, and that includes me too. It includes me discouraging them or having harsh raised voices and yelling, like protecting them from myself. So protection needs to be physical protection, but we live in a day and age where, you're unlikely to do that a lot. Um, so there's that. And then, provider is not that much different, but we associate provider with financial provision. And I think should actually be less of the role of provider. It's an important one. And if you don't have enough money, it all of a sudden becomes a really important one. But once you get to a certain threshold of income, and that weight is lifted, providing really means providing emotional safety. A lot of the things I talked about, protecting them from bad stuff, now it's providing good things for them emotionally, like providing space for my wife to have time for herself. So it's those things. So there's a lot of other stuff that comes into that as a man's role. Like he needs to provide boundaries. He's a teacher. I think he's a nurturer too. I do think that a lot of the times that is the woman's primary role. I do think she's naturally better at that. And I'm sorry if people listening to this, I don't want to reflect my views on you guys if people get offended, but I do just believe that. At least it's been true of my marriage. Like my wife is the nurturer, but that doesn't mean I don't have a role in nurturing my kids. So there's a lot of roles for a father, but those are the main three, and a lot of stuff falls under my role of being leader, protector, and provider.
I really like that framework. I think there is so much there, and I love the reframes about protector and protecting, their energy, protecting them from the world and the things that would ail them if they were allowed in, and social media and the challenges of being a modern father. In one way, I think about this a lot. I and yourself, in some instance, we were kind of the last generation of kids that had somewhat of a childhood before the phones came in. Now they're so pervasive. 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds can have phones. They'll never know a world without social media. The difficult challenge of that is our fathers couldn't have ever even gave us any guidance around how to manage those devices because they were learning alongside of us. Whereas we've seen it now. We see the traps. We see the eye candy. We see all of those things. And hopefully if we do this right, we can't remove it from the world. It's not going anywhere. We can't say that our children aren't going to, one day grow up and have access to all of this stuff. But if we instill the right values and we protect them in these very formative years and we set the right values and stuff like that, I think we can do a lot more good than we could probably imagine there. And that is a part of protection. And I think you made a really good point about kind of the tyrannical ruler versus the, integrated ruler. Like I always think of the king, magician, warrior, lover. It's a great book by Robert Gilmore,
Yeah.
I think it's Archetypes of a Man. And, the integrated king is not the tyrannical ruler that's like, sitting in his ivory tower, not listening to his queen, and he's not listening to anybody underneath him, and anybody questions him. He chops the head off because he's the boss. He's receiving counsel from his queen. If the kingdom has to go to war, he's on the front lines. Like, he's in it, right? He's the leader pulling the rock, not whipping the people on top of the rock. And I think that's really, really valuable. And I think that king leader energy is the role of the masculine in that relationship and in that role of fatherhood, granted that it is integrated. So that requires a lot of awareness for yourself, right? That requires, I think you like the term like being a whole man or being an integrated man.
Yeah.
So you've got the tyrannical kind of father on this side, and on the other end of the spectrum, you've almost got this wimpy, spineless kind of coward of a man that has no boundaries and all of that stuff. So what's the things that you think about there to really try and be in your utmost awareness and embodiment of that, so that you find that balance quite nicely between that integrated king, not being a pushover, but not being too tyrannical? And what do you think are some of the things to think about there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, first of all, it's okay to have some kind of tension about it, because you're always learning how to do that. And, um, it that can be really difficult to figure it out. But, men are trying to find um, an identity most of the time. Like, what's the man that I can be proud of? What's the narrative of manhood and masculinity I can be proud of? And a lot of times you get pushed into these two extremes. Um, so if you go back historically, so there's a book, a lot of books that talk about this. One of them is Iron John by Robert
Mm-hmm.
Bly. It's a great just book about masculinity and manhood. It's really beautifully written. He talks about like the 50s and 60s man who's the patriarch, and then we had such a negative relationship with that, emotionally stunted, just works and comes home and puts his feet up on the couch, guy who wasn't engaged to, in the 70s, this very effeminate man who um, didn't want to do any of those things, who ended up being overly passive, nice, like the nice guy
Mm-hmm.
who, confrontation can be very loving, but niceness avoids a confrontation because you want to be liked and you don't want to cause waves. That eventually leads to mistrust and a lack of integrity. Um, so it's like we overreact and we have these two extremes. And I do feel like our society puts forth one or the other. Like, which man are you going to be? Are you going to be, the kind of Andrew Tate stereotype, which I don't think Andrew Tate is the stereotype that people put him as. He's more complicated. But when you hear someone talking negatively about that
Mm-hmm.
guy, they're always talking about, it's just about money, power, being unforgiving,
Yes.
and harsh, and the big lifestyle of like having a lot of stuff, and being really successful. And a lot of guys really connect to that. If they don't have a story of masculinity they can buy into, it's like, well, that sounds like something that maybe I can be proud of or aspire to. At least looks good. So I'm going to go there. Or if they've been hurt by that, or they're getting affirmation from women for this really passive side, of things, or they feel really guilty about men's cultural history throughout time. Because I think our culture speaks that message too, especially for like white men, because I'm a middle class white man. So I came in born with a legacy that was not that great. Okay, there's ravaging of Native American Indians, there's enslavement of African Americans, there's oppression of women. There's still a lot of that stuff that
Mm-hmm.
lingers around. So I had to figure out, but I am that guy who's born into that lineage and look just like all those guys. Um, so what do I want to do now? Do I just want to be that really passive, weak guy and just say, I have no point in life. I don't matter. I shouldn't even be here anymore. I'm going to let everyone else take the reins now, because of my heritage. So, like, where do you go? And I think that the correct narrative is always rooted in love. And love is not soft, it's really tough, right? So it means, being honest, but being kind at the same time. So you want to tell the truth, especially if it's hard and uncomfortable. It's hard for me to do this at work, especially, if I have an employee that's
Mm-hmm.
underperforming, to have the honest conversation of, we got to address like work performance issues or what's going on with you. I have to tell him a negative thing or her a negative thing about themselves. But I want to be kind. Like, honesty is not licensed to be a jerk. So I want to be kind at the same time. Like I want to be understanding of somebody else and empathize, but I don't want to be passive either. If I need to butt up against that, confidence is great, but when confidence turns to arrogance, it's not. So you want to have those good things. Like I want to be humble. I love humility. I think most good men, they need to be humble, but I don't want to be insecure about that. So you have these juxtapositions of these good things with the toxic perversion or the extreme. So, you brought up that book, having that balance where you can be, you know, stoical, but you can also be empathetic when you need to be. You can be really aggressive when you're called on to be aggressive, but you also have temperance. Like you know how to curb
Mm-hmm.
that. I want men to be calm and bring calm into their lives and be that rock. Also, want men to be wild and a little bit fierce and a little bit, I want to say, unpredictable, and having a balance of those things. So you're having a good relationship with both
Yeah.
extremes, and figuring out like where is my balance. And that's I don't know if that answers your question that well, but it's a really complicated question and really nuanced, and it looks different for every man, because every human being has a different level of masculine and feminine within them. Men are generally more masculine, and women are generally more feminine. But I wouldn't even call myself a really masculine man. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. Uh, so my masculine traits are going to look different. They're going to have a different, what I would call like a feminine curve to them,
Yep.
right? But this is just human ways of putting these things into boxes. Like, oh, that's
That's
feminine,
right. That
that's
is,
masculine.
yeah.
So men can't do that, and if they do, they're womanly. And if women do that, they're being a man. No, we made that up. Having a healthy balance and you and your partner complementing each other and appreciating it instead of seeing it as the enemy is part of that process. It's really important.
Yeah. No, I think you answered that perfectly because I think that, sometimes it's easy to just be in this binary thinking it's black and white, it's left and right, it's yes, it's no, these are the hard rules, these are not what you do. When the truth is often in the middle and it's that line between order and chaos. And what you just described is how I vision it a lot too. It's range. And the wider your range is, as long as you can like dance on those poles and be aware of it, like sometimes you're going to be a little more over here, sometimes you're going to be a little more over here, but you've got good range, you're integrated enough to know how to get yourself back on that line between order and chaos. And sometimes it's going to call for a little more order, sometimes a little more flow, sometimes a little more classic manly macho man, and sometimes a little more like soft effeminate kumbaya boy. And it's all okay as long as it's done from awareness and intention and love. And I think that's what we want. I think we want range, and I think that was a cool answer, because nuance is the truth of a lot of things these days, and it doesn't do the best for the viral clips on Instagram, because those like, no, this is how it is and this is how everything is, usually performs better because that's that tribalistic thinking we've got. But the truth usually is complicated, and it requires some sense of integration like that. So I think it was a really good answer. What do you think, and this might be, a reflection for some of the mistakes that you made and some of the things you hear regularly on Instagram now, but what do you think are the biggest mistakes that new dads make?
I would say humility into it, going into fatherhood is really important. I may just speak to me, but it is something that I see across a lot of men, that is not understanding what fatherhood is going to demand, and maybe thinking they're just going to incorporate this new thing into their existing life. Um, so for me, we did not prepare for it well enough. We really should have prepared for it if I'd had the wisdom 2 or 3 years before having our first child. What is our life going to look like? Um, so I worked too much is really what it came down to, because I didn't plan to take any work reprieve. I didn't plan financially to create this space because I couldn't take work reprieve financially, and my business infrastructure wasn't in a place where I could just step off the 60 hours weeks. But now I had a child and my wife was at home, and it created a whole new bunch of needs that I was just going to incorporate into my life. Um, and I couldn't do it. And that's when I first started failing. And that first started really coming out, um, in the way I talked to my wife and the way I raised my kids. So I think new fathers need to have a greater amount of space, and emotional flexibility for what's going to happen when they have a child. Um, so there's that. And being busy often means lonely at the same time. You're too busy for stuff. Uh, I think men need a good support work going into fatherhood. If you think you're going to be able to go it alone, or you know all the things, if you're as arrogant and naive and cocky as I was, and you think you're just going to handle it, um, you're not. No man can do that. You've never done it before. It's your
Mm,
first time at it, and it's going to squeeze things that you've never had squeezed before. And stuff's going to come out that you didn't know, because you don't become a good father until you've been a father. You can't be a good father until the process of fatherhood has built you into a good father. So you become it through the process. You need other good men in your life to help you along the way. Just encouragement, just knowing other people are going through it at the same time is helpful. It keeps you from being lonely. But that again requires space. Like, men are really bad at being friends with other men because we don't have time for that. Like, we got wife, kids, family, work. We got stuff to do. Um, but I think that's actually a core part of being rooted as a father, is having men in your life that you can do stuff with. And that looks different. So this is a side note, but it was Men's Health Month in June, and there was so much advice about men going to therapy, men talking, and working on their emotional issues. Like, there's been a lot of studies showing, like, men, that's not how men work through their
mm,
issues. It's like going and sitting down with a therapist for an hour. If I need to work on something, I'm going to go to my middle brother, my next brother down. His name Buddy. We're going to go and we're going to do something. Like, he's got 40 acres in Middle Tennessee. Like, we're going to build a fence, ride horses. Like, we're going to spend a lot of the day talking about nothing. We're going to spend a lot of the day in silence. But like 5% of that day, we're going to talk about the real stuff of life. And that is how men work through issues. It's camaraderie and working through things together. And I come away from that feeling better, feeling hopeful, feeling re energized, more so than I ever did with therapy, which kind of gets me stuck in replaying all my issues and
mm-hmm.
being trapped in it sometimes. Not always. And I do think therapy is good. Don't hear me say don't go to therapy. It can be really healing. Um, my main point is that men need other men who are their friends, especially going into fatherhood. So don't be overworked and over busy, and have friends and a support network going in, are two things I would tell fathers.
Mm. Yeah, that's on point. I think a couple of things there. The therapy conversation is a tricky one, especially for men, because we're not saying don't do therapy at all. There can be a lot of value there from thinking about these things and rehashing them and talking about it. But typically, men like to do. They like to feel purposeful and they like to take action, and they typically bond over shared suffering or hard work. So if you don't have that in your family, if you don't have the middle brother that you can go and hang out with and hammer fence posts all day and then get to the good stuff, then think about where those men might exist. Maybe they're in the local jiu-jitsu club or the gym or the CrossFit, wherever it is. But like, you have to go and seek it out, because this lone wolf mentality that so many men are operating from is incredibly lonely and isolating. And then they'll start to, just lose themselves in the process and feel like they're an island. And that's where a lot of this male loneliness comes from. And we know one of the biggest killers of men under 40 is suicide. And that's just a tragic case. And I think it's a core issue here, is the lack of male relationships. And a lot of the tough guy mentality that I don't need no one. And like you were saying, hey, you have to be humble enough to know you're not just going to crush everything you do. You can't just watch one YouTube video or read one book about parenting and be like, okay, got it now. I'm gonna crush this thing. So those are really good points. And the other one about the overwork and the balance there is interesting, because I've heard you talk about this in the past too. Like, men seem to have a tricky time of where they validate themselves and where they get their self-worth from. And I think a lot of the time that comes in careers. What do you think's going on there? Why have men kind of lost the way with that and seek it maybe a bit more from careers, work, shiny objects, salaries, that kind of stuff?
So it goes back to this idea of being a whole man, and you have all these different traits that are complementary to each other and not against each other. However, a lot of those traits are complicated. Being having emotional intelligence, knowing how to navigate like a fight or an argument with your wife where she's in need, you don't feel like you can meet, or your kids are being disrespectful, and you've tried different parenting. You've tried authoritarian, don't you dare speak to me, and you tried gentle parenting, and you're like, they're still being disrespectful, and that's because they're kids. They're going to press boundaries no matter what parenting style you
Mm-hmm,
have.
mm-hmm.
Um, and that's really complicated. There's no measurable metric for you to know how well you're doing. And sometimes it's going to go down. And you're going to feel like we're in a dark place because you're going to have seasons throughout fatherhood. You're not always going to feel like we're on top of the world, everything's going great, because you're dealing with other human beings, so you can't control their emotional state. Like you might get a teenager that's just depressed, and you're like trying to figure out how to handle it out. Or like my wife, after our third child, had some serious postpartum depression, and we didn't really know what that was and didn't have it with our other kids. And that was one of the darkest periods of my life and of my marriage. And I had no idea how to navigate that. And so at home, it's those attributes that make you a successful father are hard to develop, hard to identify, to have the self awareness, and they're hard to measure.
Mm.
When you go to work, most of the traditional masculine traits are valued. So if you're going to be assertive, competitive, ambitious, like rational, logical, like cold and calculating kind of a thing, that benefits you. Sometimes having empathy at work makes your job harder. It makes my job harder when I know I need to let somebody go and I'm empathizing with their life, but I know they're not a right fit. It can be really hard for me to make that call. If I could just be ruthless and see them as cogs in a machine, and I don't think that's the best way to run an organization. I don't run mine that way. Um, but a lot of the world rewards that. And you can have goals and deadlines and things where you can see what you did. I made a sale, I got a promotion, my income is this much, the number on my screen in my bank account finally reached that 0,
Mm-hmm.
right? I got it. And it can make you feel like a man. And then the world will see that and give you a lot of affirmation. I get a lot of affirmation at work for things that I did. And, I'm in Memphis, Tennessee. A lot of big people in Memphis, like politicians and movers and shakers, will see what I did and say, "You're doing such a great job. This is a great thing for the city. We love the work you're doing." I can do all that, and my marriage is absolutely falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's going to happen when I feel like I'm failing my wife, I'm failing my kids? That's falling apart. But at work, I am killing it. It's easy for me to double down there. It's like, well, I feel worth there. So, I'm going to work later. I'm going to put more effort there because I'm seeking validation. That ties way back into this idea, if you don't heal from your father wounds where you didn't get that affirmation and validation from your dad, and your life is oriented, whether you're aware of it or not, if it's oriented around trying to get that validation back, you're going to be more easily enslaved to trying to find it in the easiest possible road, right? And that is often for men work because it values things that we have a more natural bent towards at the exclusion sometimes of things that our family needs, right? So imagine going home and your kid's having a tantrum and having a meltdown, and they need about 15 minutes for you to work through it. And you're trying to put them on a schedule like you do with your
Mm.
employees. Like, actually, no, clock in time's at 8 o'clock. So I can't help you emotionally work through this right now. You can't do that. You can't put those kind of things. But at work, man, it makes you feel good, right?
Mm.
So I think that's why men seek validation at work. It's an easier path to feeling like a man, feeling like a success.
Yeah, it's obvious. It's obvious. It's right there in the open. You can track it, measure it. You can see it reflected in zeros or the amount of jobs you do. Where at home, it's a little more of this hidden metric of how I feel and is this working? And you don't really know. And it's this giant experiment. And like you said, the seasonal aspect, now it's great. But 6 months down the line, we're going through something else and it's all a bit tumultuous. And I think that's so on point and so important. And it bridges the gap kind of nicely into my next question here, which is how do men really support their wives through motherhood?
The first thing I would say about that is, like, you're the stabilizing force. Like, you're the calm. You want to bring the calm, especially in the early years when I think the nurturing aspect of the mother in any child age, from when they're born, actually from 6 months before they're born to like age 3 or 4, specifically for boys. Yeah, I have 4 boys, so I'm more intimate with that. When they really want their mother, they want that nurturing bit. She's got a lot on her plate, and I think she needs you to step in a way that you've never done before. Um, so at my house, I want to bring the calm. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of rowdy kids. They have a lot of personalities. There's a lot of fight. There's a lot of toys on the floor. And, you talked about the balance between order and chaos. And when you have kids, it's hard for people to thrive in chaos. It just is. When there's too much of it, you do need some of it to thrive. But when it gets out of balance, and nothing will throw it out of balance like kids. And when your wife is all of a sudden now navigating all of those things, you have to like step in and take things that you didn't do before you had kids. So you're going to do more cleaning. You're going to have to do more selfless stuff that maybe you don't feel like doing, but you just got to get off your butt and do. A lot of it too is about taking responsibility over things and owning it. So you don't, Rachel and I have had this conversation a lot where I would help out. She's like, it's great. You wash dishes, you fold towels, you play with the kids, but ultimately I know I'm the one responsible for making sure those things are done. Like, I don't quite know if you're going to do it. You might do it, but it's my responsibility to do it. So you just make money and then you come home and you will help some. Me taking responsibility and ownership so that I'm taking emotional load off of her plate is really key.
Mm-hmm.
She told me one time, she goes, it's not that I want to break from my kids. I actually want to be with my kids. I just want to be with them without having to always be responsible for them.
Yeah.
Feeding them, making sure they have appropriate clothes, navigating their arguments when they come up and like, Mom, can I have this? Mom, can I do that? That you are the one that they're going to, which takes some intentional effort because she's a stay-at-home mom. She's the default parent. There's no way to go around it because she's with them all the time. So when I'm home, it's like, no, I'm owning this stuff. So it might be like simple, practical conversations like, next week, I'm cooking all the meals, which means I'm doing all the meal prep. I'm making sure we have the ingredients. I'm making sure it's healthy and it's on time. I'm doing the dishes. That emotional load is off of you. And it changes from week to week. It looks different for each family. Doing that is such a gift to my wife, like to really own those things. So bringing calm into the chaos and taking emotional ownership and responsibility over things that your wife probably just naturally is doing that you should and could be doing. And this is really important. I want men to understand they will find joy, peace, and love in that. They will find a community and intimacy with their wife that they didn't have when she owned all the responsibility for the child rearing and the keeping of the home, and you just did work. And, protecting from the gun guy who's never going to actually come into your home, most likely.
Yes.
That is a really beautiful thing. And if men see it as I have to, it's obligatory, or she needs help and he's helping his wife and not it's his job, he will always have a hard time. The dynamic will always be she's nagging him to do things and trying to pull it out of him. And that's not rest for her, right? That's not supporting her motherhood. That's not you loving your wife or your kids, right? And that's hard. Our culture, I wasn't taught that. And I don't think culture teaches people that.
No.
So
yeah, no,
that's it.
That's so good, man. It's reminded you, this is bringing up a memory actually, where you had a reel that was basically talking about this, that the mother feels so much more deeply the things that her kids are going through, and she's the default parent. She's dealing with all of this, and if you can step in and provide proactively, taking some of that emotional load off, it's so empowering, it's so enlightening for the mom. And my wife actually sent it to me and said, you do this so well. And that was like a really good moment for me to communicate in that way. Funny story as well, my wife also commented on that video and said, all of you women nitpicking this, I feel sorry for your husbands. So I know you get a lot of contentious topics and debates going on in your comment section, but either way, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I think it's that flow again. It's not traditionally masculine in terms of the Marlboro man father to do the cooking and the cleaning and the dishes, but sometimes that's exactly what life calls for. That's the season. Like right now, I do 90% of the cooking and the dishes and all of that in the house. And if I was stuck in that paradigm of like, nope, the wife is supposed to be at home and doing the dinner for me and all of that stuff, it wouldn't make any sense. And I'm not doing it from that place of resentment. I'm doing it from a place of love. So she can be more present and take that load off a little bit. And I think that's really wonderful. So we're bringing this one home here, and I feel like I could talk to you for hours, and there's so much we didn't get into today. But I wanted to ask you this question as a closing question. I'd be curious what you would like your sons to say about you in the future as the dad that they had.
That's a good question. I hope in their memory of me, more than anything, I hope they say, Dad was happy. Like, he had joy. He was good to be around. Like, there's a lot of things I hope that they say about me in terms of the way I love them, that I played with them, and all of these things. But ultimately, if I'm not happy, if I'm carrying too much weight, and that affects the home in every way. If they say that about me, I'll know that I was doing all the other things right. My marriage was right. My work-life balance was right. My self-care and investing in myself was all right. Those things were good, and it resulted in me being happy. So they remember Dad as the guy who smiled and laughed and played, and not the guy who snapped at them, who always wanted to be alone, who was staring at his screen, arguing with Mom. If they remember that instead, then I'll be like, I won life. That's it.
Love that.
You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. I think it's Maya Angelou quote. People will forget what you did. They'll forget what you said. They'll never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's it. Like,
Yes.
they'll feel like just Dad was the man to be around. And if you did that, you did win at life, my friend. I agree with that. And I'm gonna borrow some of that as well. So thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure, man. This is obviously a conversation close to both of our hearts now, and hopefully the men listening, the people that want to become fathers, the people that are fathers, I think we'll get a lot from this. And even the mums listening that want to call their man into this integrated model of fatherhood, or maybe they've got a father that's just doing this, a partner with them that they want to edify and send to. So I appreciate you. Where can people go to keep up with what you're getting up to, where you post, the Instagram handles and all of that stuff?
So Honest Fatherhood, the Instagram page is the only thing I'm doing right now that is a good place for them to reach me. There's a YouTube link on there. I just started doing YouTube because
Nice.
Men are more on YouTube than they are Instagram. Instagram is like 75% female audience, which is great, but I'm trying to speak to men. So I started YouTube, but go to the Instagram page. It's honest_fatherhood right there. And then you can find the link to the YouTube page on that. It's also Honest Fatherhood for the YouTube page as well. We're going to have some books coming out here pretty soon, and going to start doing some speaking on this idea of the whole man.
Awesome.
Pretty soon. So not quite ready for that, but I'll be jumping off on that here in a couple of months. So look out for that. That'll be fun for me.
That's awesome, man. I appreciate what you're doing. Keep doing it. Keep being honest, and just keep learning. I'm a few steps behind you in terms of number of children and their ages. So I look at you as someone that's carving the way and has some wisdom to share, and I really appreciate it, man. So way to be for being the example. And for all the dads and moms and the families out there, just keep kicking butt. It's the hardest, best job you'll ever have. And I think if we just approach it with a little more love and awareness, we can't go far wrong. So appreciate you, Daniel. Have a great day, my friend.
You too.
And listeners, we will see you next week. Bye. All right, friends, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Radical Health Radio. We got a fresh new podcast for you every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, consider liking, subscribing, reviewing, and rating us on your podcast platform. It helps to spread this message of radical health. We'll see you next week.